There is a strange pressure hidden inside modern life. You are told to be yourself. Follow your passion. Find your purpose. Ignore what others think. Discover who you really are. It sounds simple, almost obvious. But what if becoming yourself is not about discovering something that has been waiting inside you all along? What if there is no finished, authentic self hidden underneath your confusion? What if becoming yourself requires destroying parts of the person you currently believe you are? That is where the question becomes uncomfortable. Because perhaps the greatest obstacle between you and yourself is not other people. Perhaps it is the version of you that was created by other people long before you were old enough to question it. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this problem with unusual intensity. For Nietzsche, becoming yourself was not a peaceful journey of self-discovery. It was a difficult process of self-overcoming. And that process begins with the disturbing question: how much of what you call me did you actually choose? Your ambitions, your fears, your morality, your definition of success, the kind of person you are trying to become. How much of it came from you? And how much of it was quietly placed inside you by family, culture, education, religion, friends, algorithms, trends, expectations, and fear? Perhaps becoming yourself is hard because before you can create yourself, you first have to discover who has been living through you. Modern people have more freedom than many generations before them. We can choose careers, relationships, lifestyles, identities, cities, interests, and communities. We are constantly surrounded by possibilities. And yet, many people feel strangely disconnected from themselves. They know what is popular. They know what success looks like online. They know which careers appear impressive. They know what kind of body gets attention. They know which opinions receive approval. But when asked a simpler question, what do you actually want? The answer becomes much harder. This is one of the contradictions of modern freedom. The more options we have, the easier it becomes to confuse choosing with wanting. You can choose something without truly wanting it. You can pursue a career because it offers security. You can pursue another because it offers status. You can enter a relationship because being alone feels frightening. You can improve yourself because everyone around you seems to be improving. You can spend years climbing toward a life that looks impressive from the outside and still arrive feeling like you have somehow missed your own life. This is not necessarily because you made bad choices. The deeper problem is that we often make choices before examining the forces that are doing the choosing. Consider how identity now works in the age of constant visibility. You post your interests, you display your personality, you build a personal brand. You explain who you are through images, preferences, opinions, achievements, and associations. But something subtle happens when identity becomes something constantly displayed. You may begin shaping yourself according to what is easiest to communicate. Instead of asking, "Who am I becoming?" you start asking, "How will this look?" And slowly, the audience enters the room, even when nobody is physically present. The imagined reaction of others begins participating in your decisions. Will this make sense to them? Will they approve? Will I look successful? Will this fit the person they think I am? And eventually, you may become highly skilled at maintaining an identity that no longer feels entirely alive. This is one reason becoming yourself is harder than it sounds. The self is not created in isolation. You are born into languages that already exist, values that already exist, stories about success that already exist, ideas about what men and women should be, ideas about what a good life should look like. Before you begin asking who you are, the world has already begun answering for you. And some of those answers become so familiar that you mistake them for your own voice. Nietzsche saw something deeply important here. Human beings do not simply inherit traditions, they inherit interpretations. And an interpretation can become invisible when everyone around you treats it as reality. You may think your life has one obvious meaning when, in fact, you have inherited that meaning from somewhere else. You may believe your ambition is natural when it is partly social comparison. You may believe your guilt is moral truth when it is partly conditioning. You may believe your identity is stable when it is actually a collection of habits reinforced over time. This does not mean nothing about you is real. It means the question is harder. Becoming yourself may require learning to distinguish between what you genuinely value and what you have merely learned to repeat. And that is much more difficult than choosing a personality label. Nietzsche is often presented as a philosopher of rebellion, the philosopher who declared that old values had collapsed, the philosopher of the Übermensch, the will to power and radical individualism. But reducing him to slogans misses something important. At the center of Nietzsche's thought is a question about human becoming. What can a human being become when they stop treating inherited values as unquestionable? Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of the desire for fixed certainty. People want stable answers. They want to know what is good, what is evil, who they are, what their purpose is. But Nietzsche understood that these answers can become prisons. A value can guide you, but it can also prevent you from seeing alternatives. An identity can provide stability, but it can also become a cage. This is why one of Nietzsche's most challenging ideas is not simply be yourself. It is closer to the idea that you must become who you are. And that phrase contains a paradox. How can you become what you already are? Because for Nietzsche, the self is not simply a finished object waiting to be discovered. A human being is something unfinished, something in movement, something capable of transformation. You are not merely uncovering an original, pure identity hidden beneath society. You are participating in the creation of yourself. But creation is difficult. Creation requires selection. It requires rejection. It requires the willingness to say that some things within you should not remain. This is where Nietzsche becomes much less comforting than modern self-help. The modern message often says, accept yourself exactly as you are. Nietzsche would ask a different question. Which part of yourself? The fearful part? The resentful part? The passive part? The part that wants approval from everyone? The part that avoids risk and then calls avoidance wisdom? The part that blames the world for everything it refuses to change? To become yourself does not mean approving of every impulse you happen to possess. It may mean learning to organize your impulses, to cultivate some, to weaken others, to transform raw material into form. This is why Nietzsche's idea of self-overcoming matters. The self is not simply discovered. It is shaped through conflict. Not conflict with an enemy outside you, conflict with the forces within you that prevent growth. And this creates an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps your greatest enemy is not self-hatred. Perhaps it is self-protection. The desire to preserve the familiar version of yourself even when that version is no longer serving you. Today, authenticity is treated as one of the highest virtues. Be authentic. Be real. Don't pretend. But authenticity can become another form of conformity. Because once you create a fixed image of your real self, you may become afraid of changing. Imagine someone who says, "I'm just not a confident person," or "I'm an introvert, so I don't do things like that," or "I'm not creative," or "I'm just bad at relationships." At first, these statements sound like self-knowledge, but they may also be limitations disguised as identity. A description of your past becomes a prediction about your future. And suddenly, protecting your identity becomes more important than discovering your possibilities. This is the hidden danger of trying too hard to be authentic. You may become loyal to an outdated version of yourself. Nietzsche's philosophy pushes in the opposite direction. Do not merely ask whether something feels familiar. Ask whether it expands you. Do not ask only whether a path expresses your current identity. Ask what kind of person this path might allow you to become. This changes the meaning of freedom. Freedom is not simply the ability to choose whatever you want. A person can have countless choices and still be controlled by fear, still be controlled by habit, still be controlled by the need for approval, still be controlled by resentment. Nietzsche's deeper question is whether you are capable of giving form to your life. Can you take responsibility for the forces acting within you? Can you become, in some meaningful sense, the author of your direction, not the creator of every circumstance? Nietzsche is not saying you control everything. You do not choose where you are born. You do not choose every limitation. You do not control chance. But within the reality you inherit, there remains a question of response. What will you do with what has been given to you? That question is closer to Nietzsche's idea of strength than the popular image of dominance. Strength is not simply overpowering others. It can mean transforming suffering instead of merely worshiping it, transforming failure into knowledge, transforming loneliness into deeper independence, transforming confusion into a reason to investigate, transforming limitation into form. This is why Nietzsche's thought is creative rather than merely destructive. Destroying old values is not the final goal. The difficult task is creating new values. And creating values is much harder than criticizing the old ones. Almost anyone can say what they dislike. Much fewer people can decide what they are willing to live for. Here is the contradiction. Many people say they want freedom, but what they often want is freedom without uncertainty. They want to choose their own life while somehow knowing in advance that the choice is correct. They want transformation without losing familiarity. They want individuality without rejection. They want a meaningful life without the risk of failure. But these desires cannot always coexist. To genuinely become different is to enter territory where your old identity cannot guarantee your future. You may not know who you are becoming, and that uncertainty is frightening. This is why people often return to identities they have already outgrown. A familiar misery can feel safer than an unfamiliar possibility. The person who hates their career may remain because at least the identity is clear. The person who feels lonely in a relationship may remain because leaving would create uncertainty. The person who wants to create something may continue consuming because consumption carries less risk than creation. The person who wants change may endlessly research change because understanding transformation feels safer than actually transforming. This is not laziness. Often, it is an attempt to protect the self from instability. But Nietzsche's philosophy suggests something difficult. Perhaps instability is not always a sign that you are lost. Sometimes it is a sign that an old form of life is no longer large enough for you. This does not mean every uncomfortable situation is good. Suffering is not automatically meaningful. Pain is not automatically growth. But avoiding every form of uncertainty can quietly turn life into repetition. And repetition can become a kind of slow disappearance. You continue functioning. You continue performing your roles. You continue answering messages, working, buying, planning, explaining. But something inside you begins to feel absent. Not because you have no identity, but because your identity has become entirely inherited. You are living a life that can be explained perfectly by everyone except you. This is why becoming yourself is not primarily about self-expression. It is about self-examination. Before you ask how to express yourself, you may need to ask who is speaking. Whose ambition is this? Whose fear? Whose definition of success? Whose morality? Whose life am I trying to justify? These questions can be dangerous because they do not always produce comfortable answers. You may discover that you have spent years pursuing approval from people you no longer respect. You may discover that an ambition you thought was yours was actually a response to insecurity. You may discover that some of your strongest opinions were inherited before you ever examined them. But this discovery is not failure. It is the beginning of freedom, not freedom as certainty, freedom as awareness. There is another tension in Nietzsche's philosophy that feels especially relevant today. The desire to improve yourself can become another form of self-rejection. Modern culture is obsessed with optimization. Improve your body, improve your productivity, improve your income, improve your relationships, improve your appearance, improve your habits. Even rest must now become optimized. The problem is not growth itself. The problem is the psychology underneath it. Why do you want to improve? There is a profound difference between creating yourself and constantly correcting yourself. One comes from possibility, the other may come from contempt. If every act of self-improvement begins with the belief that your current self is unacceptable, then improvement may never end. Because the problem is not your performance. The problem is the relationship you have with your existence. You become trapped in permanent self-surveillance. Every weakness becomes evidence. Every failure becomes an accusation. Every successful person becomes a comparison. And the future version of you becomes a weapon against the present version. Nietzsche's philosophy of self-overcoming is often misunderstood here. Self-overcoming is not the same as self-punishment. It is not endlessly attacking yourself until you become impressive. It is closer to an artist working with difficult material. The artist does not deny the material exists. They work with it. They shape it. They transform it. Your limitations are part of your material. Your history is part of your material. Your mistakes are part of your material. Even your contradictions are part of your material. The question is not whether your life is already perfect. The question is whether you can create something from what is actually there. This is one of Nietzsche's most demanding ideas. You do not need to love every event that happens to you, but can you learn to affirm life without requiring life to become perfectly convenient first? Can you stop waiting for ideal conditions before beginning to live? This connects to Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, love of fate. It is often simplified as love everything that happens. But a deeper interpretation is more challenging. It asks whether you can relate to your life in such a way that you stop endlessly fantasizing about becoming someone with a completely different past. Can you work with reality rather than permanently negotiating with what cannot be changed? This does not mean accepting injustice or refusing to improve circumstances. It means recognizing that resentment alone cannot create a future. At some point, creation requires energy, and energy cannot remain entirely devoted to arguing with the past. So, what does becoming yourself actually look like? Perhaps it begins with selection, not adding more identities, removing unnecessary ones, not asking what personality you should adopt, asking which habits of thought no longer deserve authority. Notice the moments when you automatically say, I am this kind of person. Then pause. Is that a discovery or a defense? Does this identity describe a living possibility, or does it protect you from risk? You do not have to destroy every identity, but you should be careful about worshiping one. An identity should serve life. Life should not become a servant of identity. Then examine your ambitions, not whether they are socially impressive, whether you could still respect them if nobody applauded. Would you still want this career if no one could see the title? Would you still create if no one could like it? Would you still pursue this relationship if it gave you no social proof? Would you still value this achievement if comparison disappeared? These questions do not magically reveal a pure self, but they expose the hidden audience. And sometimes the audience is more powerful than we realize. Becoming yourself may also require learning to tolerate being misunderstood. This is difficult because social acceptance is not meaningless. Human beings need relationships. We need recognition. We are not isolated creatures floating above society. But there is a difference between belonging and surrendering your judgment. If every decision must be understandable to everyone around you, then your life will be limited by the imagination of your audience. Some forms of growth will look strange before they look reasonable. Some decisions will disappoint people. Some transformations will make old relationships uncomfortable. That does not automatically mean you are correct. But it does mean disapproval is not always evidence that you are wrong. You must learn to think. And thinking sometimes separates you from the crowd. Nietzsche's philosophy also asks us to become more suspicious of resentment. Resentment can give life a strange form of purpose. It tells you who to blame, who to hate, who is responsible for your unhappiness. And sometimes criticism is justified, but a life organized entirely around opposition remains dependent on what it opposes. If your identity is built only around what you reject, then your enemy still helps define you. Creation asks a more difficult question. What do you affirm? What are you building? What deserves your energy? What kind of life would be worth shaping even if nobody needed to be defeated? This is harder than anger. Anger can feel clear. Creation is uncertain. But creation is where individuality begins. Perhaps the hardest part of becoming yourself is accepting that you may become unfamiliar to yourself. You may outgrow opinions you once defended passionately. You may lose ambitions that once gave you direction. You may stop wanting the things you worked hard to obtain. You may discover that the person you were trying to become was necessary only because you did not yet know another possibility. This can feel like failure, but perhaps it is evidence of movement. A tree does not remain loyal to its seed. A person should not remain permanently loyal to every earlier version of themselves. Growth is not betrayal. Change is not automatically inauthenticity. Sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is admit that the old self no longer fits. And this requires humility, because becoming yourself is not the same as finally discovering the correct answer to who you are. There may be no final answer. You are not a puzzle waiting to be solved once and for all. You are a living process. This is both frightening and liberating. Frightening because there is no permanent guarantee. Liberating because you are not obligated to remain a monument to your past. Your history matters. Your choices matter. Your character matters. But none of these require you to become frozen. Nietzsche forces us to see identity differently, not as a possession, but as a task. Not, what is my true self? But, what am I willing to become responsible for? Not, how can I finally arrive? But, what kind of life am I creating through what I repeatedly choose? And perhaps this is why becoming yourself is so difficult. Because it is easier to inherit a life than to create one. It is easier to repeat values than examine them. It is easier to maintain an identity than risk transformation. It is easier to criticize the world than decide what you will build inside it. But the difficulty may be precisely what makes the question meaningful. Perhaps you will never discover a final, completed version of yourself. Perhaps there is no hidden essence waiting somewhere beneath all your confusion. Then perhaps that is not tragic. Perhaps it is freedom. Not the freedom of having no limits. Not the freedom of being able to become anything. but the freedom of recognizing that the person you have been is not the only person you are capable of becoming. Nietzsche does not offer the comfort of a permanent identity. He offers something more demanding, the possibility that a human life can become a work of creation. But creation requires courage. It requires questioning what feels natural. It requires letting old identities lose their authority. It requires facing uncertainty without immediately running back to the familiar. And above all, it requires a difficult kind of honesty. The honesty to ask, if I removed the expectations I inherited, the fears I learned, the roles I performed, and the approval I kept chasing, what would still remain? Maybe not a final answer, maybe only a space, an uncomfortable, uncertain space. But perhaps that space is where becoming begins. Because the question is not whether you have already found yourself. The question is whether you are brave enough to stop protecting a version of yourself that you have already outgrown. And perhaps the deepest challenge of all is this. What if becoming yourself does not mean returning to who you were before the world changed you? What if it means becoming someone you could never have imagined before you began questioning the world? That question has no easy answer. And perhaps that is exactly where a life becomes interesting. For more questions that begin where easy answers end, continue exploring Aporita.